Done.
Again, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to those who may be listening to this recorded. Welcome to another National Institute for Congestion Reduction webinar series. My name is Stephanie Lewis. I will be the moderator for today's presentation. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Shaping the On-Demand Era for a Sustainable and Equitable Transportation Future. It is my pleasure to welcome our three presenters today. I will tell you a little bit more about them before I hand it over for them for some formal remarks. Our first presenter today will be Ipek Shinar. Dr. Shinar is a research scientist at Texas A&M Transportation Institute with around 20 years of experience in transportation research. She has led various interdisciplinary studies through the lens of social and behavioral sciences, examining individuals' decisions and activity travel patterns, the changing nature of transportation choices, and the related impact on and or connections to well-being, as well as sustainable mobility. Our next presenter today will be Austin Cebu. Austin is a research assistant at Texas A&M Transportation Institute, working under Dr. Shinar for 1 year. He recently graduated from Texas A&M with a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in statistics. Our final presenter will be Audrey Cabay. She is a research assistant at Texas A&M Transportation Institute, working as well for Dr. Shinar on shared mobility and transportation equity. She graduated from Rice University, which is a bachelor's degree in health sciences, with focus on designing and assessing travel intervention programs. With that, I will hand the presentation over to Ipek. Ipek, take it away.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. That is a wonderful, kind introduction. It is a great pleasure to be here today and have the opportunity to discuss our project, which is focusing on shared mobility, in particular on-demand shared mobility. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. So we are just starting now. What I would like to do first is to set the stage and bring our minds together regarding some of the well-established points to provide a foundation for our discussion. And then Austin and Audrey will take us into more project-specific details and our findings. Emerging technologies, as we all going through, have simply changed the way that we approach mobility, providing new options, providing new opportunities for transportation. In recent years, we have all witnessed the rapid emergence of shared and on-demand mobility services, ranging from micromobility options like bike sharing or e-scooter sharing to car-based services and ride-hailing platforms, among many others. They have gained significant popularity, some of them, and some of them have already become the mainstream. So the advancements in emerging transportation technologies offer many benefits and provide an opportunity for us, especially, to reimagine the path across the overall transportation ecosystem. For example, these services provide convenient and flexible transportation options, enabling people to travel without the need for large upfront investments or the responsibilities of car ownership, like when we think about insurance or maintenance or the parking. And for some of us, access to these services is just a few taps away on our smartphones, making it easier for individuals to reach their destinations efficiently and on demand. But this is, in a way, it happens in our ideal world. Although these services offer many benefits, there have been various challenges associated with them, intensifying existing problems or potentially creating new ones. One significant challenge that we see, for instance, is the potential increase in traffic congestion if there is a rise in the number of motorized vehicles on the road because of these new services, car-based services especially, which have adverse effects on sustainability, leading to various different transportation and public health issues, increased air pollution and noise in our communities. Additionally, equity issues arise as these mobility services may not really be accessible to everyone and may have the potential to isolate and marginalize diverse populations, leaving them behind and unfortunately preventing them from fully benefiting from these services. limited smartphone ownership, lack of access to mobile banking services, and insufficient broadband connectivity are just some examples of key barriers faced by underserved communities. So we started our study by acknowledging that the existence of emerging mobilities, their simple existence, does not guarantee sustainability and it does not guarantee equity. And we wanted to better understand what the barriers are, mostly from an individual perspective within the context of our current study, and what the potential solutions could be to promote sustainable and equitable mobility for everyone. Accordingly, in our first phase, our focus was more on insights into service use and adoption patterns. We examined challenges to access and use of on-demand transportation services and identified potential targeted improvements in addressing these challenges. And as I noted earlier, our focus is on sharing or pooling a ride when using these on-demand services, such as in the case of transportation network companies or TNCs and microtransit services. Then, building on the insights that we gathered from this first phase, in the second phase, we focused more on mobility gaps regarding on-demand shared mobility, as well as the needs and barriers and potential solutions for underserved populations. So our end goal is to foster inclusive and sustainable transportation systems. Now, Austin will take us through the first phase, which we completed earlier this year, as of February 2023. And then Audrey will go through the second phase, which is currently an ongoing study. Austin?
All right. Thank you, Dr. Shinar. So yeah, this is an already completed phase. Our report has been written and it's under review. So I'm just going to highlight some of the key findings from the first phase. So one possible solution to address a lot of the sustainability issues associated with these emerging technologies that Dr. Shinar mentioned earlier is to increase the number of shared and pooled rides and thus reduce single occupancy vehicle use. Doing so could provide a variety of benefits. If more people are sharing rides and there are fewer cars total on the road, this can reduce overall vehicle miles traveled. You can burn less fuel and save costs of gasoline, as well as like reducing pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. From the perspective of transportation providers, you can reduce the sizes of the fleets required to meet consumer demand. This could have savings, which can be passed on to the consumer or reinvested back into the company or into the service, and it can also alleviate traffic congestion. And as more and more of the cars being sold today are electric, there has to be investments in our infrastructure to keep up with that, namely things like more charging stations. If we can reduce the fleet sizes required to meet consumer demand, then we can reduce the number of charging stations and other investments in infrastructure needed to operate said fleets. So given some of these benefits that we highlighted, the main focus of phase one was on sharing rides, sharing as a whole across all on-demand services, including TNCs, microtransit, taxis. The main research questions that we were trying to answer in phase one were who are currently sharing rides and who are the people that are not sharing rides? Why are these people not sharing rides? And how can we encourage them to share rides? Like what policies could we pass? What programs could we implement that would encourage more pooled rides versus solo rides? So in order to help us answer this question, we collected data using a shared mobility survey. So an online sample of participants was recruited via Qualtrics, and an electronic survey was administered between February and May of 2022. The survey was conducted in 10 select cities across Texas. If you look at the map, you can see which of those 10 cities they are, along with the sample size and the overall share of the sample that they represent. And we used representative quotas to make sure that the sample was as representative of the overall Texas population as possible when compared to the 2020 census data. And all 10 of these cities were chosen because at the time of the launch of the survey, they had access to all of the on-demand services that were of interest to us, like namely TNC's Microtransit. And after filtering out non-meaningful responses and bad data, we had a final usable sample size of 2,527 surveys. After having collected the surveys, we performed a variety of data analysis techniques. This will be a brief overview of what we did in the report. The main model that we built was a binary logistic regression model. We tried to model the likelihood an individual would opt to share a ride, given that they had already used on-demand services before. A variety of variables relating to the individual and their households, including sociodemographic characteristics, attitudes, and transportation behaviors were considered. And a final model was created with statistical significance, parsimony, and intuition all being considered. Then Kruskal-Wallis tests were performed on 5-point Likert scale responses to determine whether attitudes towards services were different across different groups. Like participants were asked, like, what is your opinion of a particular service, from strongly positive to strongly negative. We converted that to a numerical response and performed if these responses were the same across all groups. And Pearson's chi-square test was used to determine whether certain policies were more popular among certain groups and were more favored by particular groups. So after having conducted all this analysis, what do we find? Who is on board with sharing? So in terms of demographics, we found that those who are more likely to share tend to be male, younger, and those with higher income and education. One common barrier that many female and non-binary travelers say that they have when sharing a ride with strangers is that they cite safety as a big concern. And that's a big reason why they're hesitant to share rides with strangers. Male travelers don't have as big a concern with safety as female and non-binary travelers do. Older users tended to say that they were more hesitant about adopting new technology. Younger participants in the survey said that they're very open-minded about technology, and they tend to be among the earliest adopters of new technology. And since a lot of these services require the use of smartphones and apps, it requires a certain level of tech savviness that would inherently favor younger users. And one interpretation that we had as to why higher income and higher education demographics were more on board with sharing, despite the fact that usually shared rides cost less than solo rides, is that despite the financial incentives to share, these services may still be beyond the reach of the poorest communities, implying that perhaps policies that reduce the cost of these services might have a bigger impact on those in the lowest income brackets. We did find that habits and perceptions of individuals were more predictive than sociodemographic characteristics. The biggest effect of any of the variables that we saw was whether they were an early adopter of new technology or if they tended to wait a while before adopting, which again makes sense. A lot of these services require the use of smartphones, apps, the internet. So if you're tech savvy, you're probably more likely to benefit from these services. People who are frequent transit users are likely already used to sharing a ride with strangers and being in public spaces with strangers. So sharing a ride in a vehicle is probably not as big of a mental leap for them. And those who have a hybrid work environment, as opposed to like a strict work from home environment or a strict daily commute, might have a more flexible work schedule and work hours, which considering the fact that if you share rides with strangers, you're going to add a little bit more time to your daily commute. If you have more flexible hours, you might be willing to take on that additional uncertainty in travel times. We found that non-white participant respondents were more likely to favor these services than white survey respondents, with Asians having the most favorable attitudes towards these services. Now, one possible explanation for this is the fact that Asians across all races tended to say that they were the earliest adopters of new technology, just once again highlighting how important that variable is. And those with no disabilities tend to have more favorable attitude than those with one or more disabilities. It's likely that if you have a disability, you might need more time, more space, more assistance with your transportation needs. And so having additional strangers in the vehicle with you is likely going to be inconvenience. And urban residents are typically going to have more access to these services than rural or suburban residents. So they're probably have more favorable attitudes towards these services as a result. So we asked participants, what are the negative aspects of sharing that turn people off from using these services? These were the top 3 complaints across all participants. Extended travel times intuitively makes sense. As you add more people to your vehicle, you're going to have your trip is going to take longer, and that can be an inconvenience for people. Getting paired with unpleasant passengers, women and non-binary travelers were particularly more likely to cite this as an issue than males. And concerns about germs are likely at an all-time high due to us just having come out of the pandemic. Perhaps it would be interesting to see if that third variable is going to be different in several years down the line now, once COVID is no longer in our minds. But then what are some of the positive aspects of sharing? The top one that everybody seems to agree on is the monetary savings. Like, it's typically speaking cheaper to share a ride than to take your own personal ride. So people like saving money, despite the fact that it is inconvenient to add more people to your vehicle during a trip. It's still likely faster than walking, biking, and transit for a lot of people's transportation needs. So despite the additional inconveniences of sharing, it's still more convenient than a lot of existing transportation services. And a lot of those people who typically shared tend to be a little bit more environmentally conscious, and they're aware of some of the benefits of pooled rides as opposed to single rides. So what strategies can we adopt to encourage more ride sharing? So survey participants were asked to choose from a list of operational improvements to the service directly, along with programs that governments and employers could implement that would make them personally, as an individual, more likely to share rides as opposed to taking like single rides. So if you recall that extended travel times were the number one biggest concern that people typically have with sharing rides. So things like guaranteeing a drop-off window, reimbursement for delayed trips, limiting the number of extra stops, that can help mitigate a lot of those effects. So if people are less likely to be inconvenienced by using this service, they're probably more likely to use those services. The second biggest complaint that people had was relating to the safety of traveling, of potentially getting paired with unpleasant passengers. So policies such as video surveillance, reporting safety incidents, and additional security at boarding zones will likely make travelers feel safer while using these services. And if travelers feel safer, then they're probably more likely to use those services. Things like subsidizing the costs and having rewards programs for shared trips can help address some of those gaps in usage amongst high and low income participants and make these services more affordable to all participants. And things like flexible working hours and work from home policies would likely give people the flexibility that they need to take on the added uncertainty of sharing a ride as opposed to just taking their own personal ride wherever they want to go. Not all policies have the same effect on everyone. Different groups can have different concerns and may prefer different programs. We did compare several variables such as race, income, residential area, but for sake of time, we shall only focus on differences across gender. Gender also happened to have some of the most significant gaps. And so we thought that was a particularly interesting variable to consider. If you look at the slides, these are policies that each gender is statistically more likely to favor than the other gender at the 5% significance level. Unfortunately, non-binary and third gender participants were excluded from this analysis due to a small sample size. If you look at the female gender strategies, you can notice things like security at boarding zones and onboard video surveillance were particularly popular. This can help address some of those concerns that female travelers have with sharing a ride with strangers. Women were also more likely to care about their travel times being extended too long. So limiting the number of additional stops and reimbursing people if their trip goes on too long were particularly popular amongst women. Among men, there seems to be a wide range of issues that pertain to them. Things like designated boarding zones and improved sidewalks, improve accessibility of their services at a particular point, particularly for people who might be elderly or disabled. Parking cash out programs employed by employers and pre-tax benefits and subsidies relate to making the programs cheaper, flexible working hours, and better service connections. These are all like a wide variety of issues that men care about in comparison to women who seem to mostly care about travel time and safety. So we focused mostly on existing technology in the previous slides, like TNCs and Microtransit. We also asked survey participants about autonomous vehicles, which is a technology that's emerging. It hasn't quite taken off yet, but may do so sometime in the near or distant future. We asked them, would you be willing to share a ride in an autonomous or self-driving vehicle with strangers? And what are some of those attractive features that of shared autonomous vehicles that people have? They said fast and reliable travel times and monetary savings were big, which is relevant to what we said before. And they said the vehicle experience seems safe, like as in they only expect autonomous vehicles to be available in the market if regulatory agencies had already deemed it to be a safe method of transportation. So there seems to be safety, financial travel time reliability, and financial benefits seem to be a recurring pattern that all travelers seem to have. And some improvements to, these are some of the 5 improvements to shared autonomous vehicles that people said that would make them personally more likely to share a ride with a stranger. These all relate to safety of other people and not of the vehicle themselves. What we found that is that the biggest impact that shared autonomous vehicles seem to have is not the shared part, is the autonomous vehicles part. People are more hesitant about getting into a car with without a driver than they are about getting into a self-driving vehicle with other strangers. So it appears to be less of a leap to go from driverless cars to shared driverless cars, as opposed to going from a car with a driver to a driverless car, if that makes sense. So some of the key takeaways that we saw in phase 1 was that various groups, typically female, low income, and older users, are less likely to share rides. Attitudes and habits and perceptions matter more than social demographic characteristics and are more predictive of an individual's likelihood of sharing a ride than their inherent characteristics. And some common barriers that people face tend to be travel time, trip costs, concerns about safety, and being paired with unpleasant passengers. So if we can address some of these concerns using some of those policies that we mentioned earlier, we can improve the access and favorability that people have towards shared rides and possibly mitigate some of those sustainability issues that Dr. Shinar mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. So that was phase one. We're currently in phase two. Audrey will give a brief overview of some preliminary results that we have found and describe what exactly we are doing in phase two.
Thank you, Austin. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. So I'm Audrey, and I did the first part of phase two, which is currently ongoing. So phase two is about advancing equity and congestion relief and investigation into on-demand shared rides for underserved populations. So this portion of the project is strongly focused on transportation equity. Our working definition of transportation equity is the ability for all people to travel easily throughout their region without undue time, monetary, physical, or other burdens. And the reason that we're focused on it is transportation equity has significant impacts on individual and community health outcomes, economic opportunities, local environment, and pollution. Ease of transportation overall is a foundation to higher quality of life. As long as there's stress or uncertainty surrounding transportation, it's difficult to secure and fulfill other needs. So we'll be discussing the results of part one of this study focused on shared modes with a particular focus on transportation network companies, private and pooled ride services like Uber and Lyft. Something to note is that the language hasn't settled, and so pooled, shared, split, etc. you may see in other studies a variety of terms. I'm going to be using pooled today. All right, so our research questions were, how do people with underserved transportation needs currently use transportation network companies? And what are the individual motivators and factors affecting their willingness to use shared rides, particularly pooled TNCs? So our goals were to understand individuals' transportation challenges in depth and to investigate the specific barriers and motivators that apply for different underserved populations. Although many groups are underserved, lack of transportation exists in multiple forms. After the results of phase one, which focused on global use of shared mobility in Texas cities, we wanted to recognize and investigate the differences in transportation access when it comes to shared mobility. So these interviews that I conducted were the first part of our ongoing study on transportation equity and shared mobility. So my process, I conducted 35 interviews last year. The reason we chose to do qualitative interviewing is that it provides the opportunity for a rich, detailed account of travel and experience, including necessary context like a participant's geography, ability, or disability, and personal attitude. All of these factors affect individual level decision-making and use behaviors. So I conducted 35 interviews with people with a wide range of characteristics and geographies last year. We specifically recruited older adults, people with disabilities, people with low income, and people of a racial or ethnic minority to hear their transportation experiences. I followed a semi-structured interview method that allowed me to investigate my research questions thoroughly while also allowing interviews to follow the course of conversation and follow unforeseen topics and learn more about systematic discrimination and disadvantage at the individual level. One example, I knew that accessible vehicles were not universally available to disabled passengers, but I didn't know that advocacy groups in certain cities had successfully negotiated wheelchair accessible vehicle programs from Uber for their cities. So this diagram represents the process I undertook for a thematic analysis. First, I conducted the interviews where I took notes. After the interviews were all concluded, I re-listened to the recordings that I had taken and edited my notes to add anything I might have missed. Then I separated the information according to what research topic it was accorded to, so transportation challenges, private rides, pooled rides, and microtransit. And then within these topics, I identified multiple themes. For example, pooled TNC rides. TNC ride use had themes around possible improvements, common complaints, and disability-related challenges. And then finally, I combine and categorize data more finely to respond strongly to our research questions. Although most participants cited transportation challenges, the most inhibited and transportation burdened participants typically did not drive or did not own a car. So some drivers were financially burdened by car ownership, but most drivers reported few to no routine challenges. Then disability, although varied in its impacts, was often difficult to accommodate for or navigate with. Medical transportation and paratransit, two commonly used modes by participants, were inflexible and didn't fully meet their travel needs and had significant gaps in service timing, which means that service availability was commonly from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. And it varied by region, but depending on your needs, and especially if you wanted to have a social life, that made a social life quite inaccessible. Affordability and cost-prohibitive transportation was the most commonly reported problem for all participants, although mostly experienced by non-drivers who struggled to find affordable, reliable transportation. Some drivers were financially burdened, especially with the increases in cost of living, including gas and car insurance. Drivers stated that they were reducing the number of trips, choosing to drive a smaller vehicle if they could, and that their food security had been impacted by the increase in costs. Finally, low-income rural residents with disabilities experienced the most restrictive transportation challenges. Low or no-cost modes like transit, biking, and walking were unavailable, and if they also didn't drive or couldn't afford a car, their primary means of transportation were rides from friends and family. Multiple participants who were in this situation reported feeling extremely isolated, very low degree of independence. Although I want to point out that not everybody felt this way. One participant who relied on his husband fully for his daily travel actually enjoyed it and faced no routine challenges. He was able to use his power chair in a 1-mile radius and would rely on his husband for the rest. So, as expected, increasing intersections and marginalization increase the burdens on an individual. So rural areas and their residents, as well as low-income and high racial and ethnic minority neighborhoods in urban areas, face limited transportation offerings. So among the interviewees who used private TNC rides, there were two types of riders. The most frequent riders interviewed were younger and employed with no or unreliable car. Personal trips and medical trips were the most common trip type for these people, and work and school trips were equally common among car owners and participants who didn't own cars. Light life or special event trips were the most common trip type for car owners, specifically to avoid drinking and driving or having to negotiate a very complicated parking situation. Drivers mostly used private TNC rides as a plan B option in case they're using their personal vehicle was not possible. And then non-users were older, more likely to be retired, which matches the results from phase 1. Blind interviewees and interviewees who use wheel and power chairs were also unlikely to be users. For interviewees with disabilities who did use transportation network company rides, they enjoyed rides and found them useful and reliable. However, for wheel and power chair users, the unavailability of waves made the service unreliable, and they were the only group to report TNC rides as unreliable. Currently, some TNC companies offer waves in limited geographies for a limited number of hours a day, while other companies don't offer wave services at all. This is in response partly to disability advocacy groups that I mentioned earlier, who have been pressuring and litigating to get transportation network companies to provide more accessible transportation. Aside from waves, blind and deaf interviewees reported difficulties communicating with drivers. Deaf participants were more likely to use TNC rides than blind participants because they could more easily locate their vehicle, but they reported that some drivers panic when faced with someone they can't speak to. However, blind participants were unlikely to use TNC rides because of the difficulty to find their vehicle, get into it, and feel safe in a ride. They had increased safety concerns. Deaf participants asked for better communication tools and technology in the app to allow drivers and riders to communicate safely while the vehicle was moving, and for driver education programs. Driver education would familiarize drivers with how to communicate with deaf riders, as well as how to provide assistance to any rider who would need it. Participants had multiple ideas and requests for types of assistance, including loading and unloading bags, putting a wheelchair into the car, walking to someone to a door, etc. Something I want to note here is that some participants who did use a wheelchair could use a TNC ride if they were also able to use a cane or walker. However, it should be noted that that's actually a less comfortable way for them to travel. And even for participants who have the option of using a cane or walker, being able to use their wheelchair is the most comfortable and best way for them to travel, so they should be accommodated for. So far we've discussed private TNC rides. The pooled and shared rides were also investigated. Participants reported enjoying the cost savings, reduced environmental impact, and safety of pooled TNC rides. However, riders who use TNCs for nightlife or travel trips were unlikely to choose pooled rides because the cost savings weren't significant enough compared to the unpredictable duration of time. And also, when returning late at night, were completely uninterested in sharing a ride with potentially drunk passengers. Multiple interviewees were uncomfortable with sharing space, while others were worried for women's safety when sharing a ride with others. Immunocompromised people and seniors were also concerned about their health and safety due to exposure to disease, especially COVID. When interviews were conducted, one participant noted that, for example, bus drivers from transit agencies were still required to wear masks, but that TNC drivers were not, leaving her feeling exposed to risk of infection. So she preferred to ride the bus. We also investigated microtransit. So out of 35 interviewees, only 5 had heard of microtransit. Once it was explained to participants, most of them were interested in the service if it was more flexible than a traditional fixed transit service and cheaper than a TNC ride. The service would need adaptations for equal access regardless of physical ability, including waves, as part of the vehicle fleet and having them widely available. One opportunity for microtransit programs would be to target suburban parents who currently drive their children around, emphasizing the convenience, time savings, and safety for them by letting their children ride would be an ideal match for the service. Some participants made veiled and explicitly discriminatory comments about other passengers, determining whether they would use a ride service or not, saying that their area had like a mixed demographics and that if it wasn't somebody who was like them, they wouldn't ride with them. So some proposed safety features would allow passengers to see a picture or a name of other riders. This has been proven in the past to affect driver-to-rider discrimination. So this may open the door for discrimination not just between a driver and a rider, but other riders too. Safety tools, no matter how well-intentioned, could become a channel for discrimination, so which should be taken into account during design. So some potential strategies for improvements. We have 2 avenues: operational improvements held by providers and agencies who roll out these programs in the future would include improved wheelchair accessible vehicle availability, promoting driver accessibility education, localizing pooled ride marketing campaigns to address specific concerns to a certain demographic or geography. For example, in Texas, people are much more conscious of personal space. And then advertising and enforcing a code of conduct to set standards of safety and clear expectations across the board. Then government policies could focus on electrifying and promoting shared modes to maximize environmental benefits, and then putting a priority on accessible, affordable rural transportation, incorporating shared services in municipal and regional transportation planning. As mentioned earlier, given the most restrictive effects are felt by rural area residents, priority should be put on reaching a base level of public transportation in those areas. Incorporating shared modes in rural areas and elsewhere into a regional transportation strategy could increase connectivity, decrease car dependency, and increase ridership. I also want to note that the intersection of a low-income, disabled rural resident is not unlikely. As our rural areas age and get older, there's higher prevalence of disability, higher rates of poverty, and so that becomes a common type of rider who should be accommodated for and provided for. So to recap what we've discussed, the interview section is the first completed part of our phase 2 of our NICR shared mobility study. Shared ride services are seen as a useful and reliable service despite safety concerns. Transportation network companies currently provide reliable bridging transportation for non-drivers, and shared ride services and microtransit both face a lack of visibility. Most people haven't heard of them and haven't used them and don't have them available in their local area. However, our focus populations experience common barriers to using shared ride services: high cost of a single ride, risk of disease exposure, and inaccessible vehicle fleets. And now, Dr. Shania, it's back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Audrey. So what is next on our agenda? As we mentioned earlier, we are still working on phase 2. We completed our interviews, as Audrey described, which provided great insights, but also helped us to make some revisions to our phase 1 shared mobility survey and to tailor it to the specific focus or content of the phase 2. We then deployed the survey recently across the United States as part of the second phase of the project, and currently in the process of analyzing the data through an equity lens. So we are having a deeper dive based on the issues that we have identified during the interviews and some of the challenges that are being faced, especially by historically underserved population groups, including the availability of the service, accessibility of the service, and affordability of these services. And we do expect to complete this second phase in later this month as well. So last but not least, this study has been a true team effort. We have received amazing support and contributions from TTI researchers and staff, as well as the NICR team. So on behalf of 3 of us, I would like to thank all of them for their support throughout this research project, whether it is related to the conduct of the study tasks or the management of the project activities. Thank you very much, everyone. And with this, we are concluding our presentation. Please feel free to get in touch with any questions. In addition to, of course, our current QA session today, we have added the links for the project websites for both phases. And I think I'm responding one of the questions that have been put on the QA box. So our reports will be available, and other relevant publications are or will be posted as well as they become available. Thank you very much again, Stephanie. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Ipek, Austin, and Audrey, for the great presentation and all of the wonderful information on phase 1 and phase 2 of your study. Again, I will quickly note that if you would like to receive notifications about when those research projects are available, the link to sign up for the NICR newsletter, if you're not already included, is available in the web link section. It is number 4. A quick reminder, if you have any questions for any of our presenters today, the Q&A box is located on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Simply type in any questions and or comments that you have, and we'll get to as many questions as we can in the next 13 minutes or so. The first question comes in. It says, what specific policies were or are recommended with dealing with the unpleasant passengers concern?
Yeah, I can get started on that one. So basically, onboard video surveillance was very popular, particularly amongst women, which makes sense. If people know that they're being watched, probably more likely to behave. Same thing with being able to match with passengers from a known trusted network, say like your school, your work, your friend group, etc. That would likely reduce the possibility of having like unpleasant passengers, just because like if you're getting paired with people that you know, as opposed to strangers, people likely to be more feel more safer. Things like having an on-call concierge number where you can directly contact the transportation provider in the event that the driver or the passengers are being unpleasant was also popular. having a formal code of conduct for passengers, and then being able to rate passengers. So when you open up the app and you're about to see like who else is going to be in the vehicle with you, you can kind of see people's like rating. So somebody who has like a high rating, other passengers have said that they enjoyed traveling with this person and that they were respectful or whatever. Somebody with a low rating, you're probably less likely going to share a vehicle with them. We also found that with regards to seeing people's ratings, women in particular favor being able to see like an individual's like name and gender prior to being paired together. And women were in favor of an option for having like members of the same gender only in the vehicle. Men don't seem to care about that as much. And that's something that we saw in the literature as well. Like a prior study found that female travelers were more likely to prefer having members of their same gender in the vehicle with them as opposed to male travelers. So those are just a handful of policies that can help address some of the issues that people have regarding unpleasant passengers being in the vehicle with them.
Thank you. There is another question that I'm going to kind of skip down a little bit. I'm going to ask this sort of question that I think sort of fits in this same talking about passengers. Is there any indication that larger vehicles make people more comfortable about shared trips versus smaller vehicles? I didn't know if the study focused on that vehicle size.
So if I recall, for phase 1, we did not ask that question, but in the phase 2 survey, we did ask them, like, I forget the exact phrasing of the question, but it was something along the lines of like, what sort of vehicle would you be willing to share like a trip with, like the size of the vehicle or the number of available seats or the number of passengers you'd be willing to share with. So that wasn't something we considered in phase 1, but I know something similar to that effect was asked in the phase 2. If Dr. Shinar or Audrey can specify that.
Yes, and in specifically in that we did, as Austin mentioned, we didn't specifically ask for the vehicle size in the first phase. However, there were a lot of indications because of the responses that we received, such as requesting more personal space. Larger vehicles typically offer more physical space. This was especially important, and Audrey can talk more about that regarding the equity perspective. But when, for instance, for people with disabilities, more space may actually provide a little bit more comfort, and a perception of safety is also increasing. So we didn't really specifically go through the vehicle size as part of phase 1, but we are going into more details as part of phase 2.
Wonderful, thank you. Can you tell us what was the sample size for phase 1?
Sure. Go ahead, Audrey. Austin.
Oh yeah, it was 2,527.
Wonderful, thank you. Any thoughts? So this is a question. It says, any thoughts on how to balance the safety concern versus the potential for discrimination? For example, rating systems of drivers and passengers and the ability for the users to see others' profiles.
So that is a concern that we had, and I think in the literature, it was cited that, like, for example, like in the past, that like certain drivers are more likely to discriminate against like Black riders, for example. Like if they saw a name that they thought was stereotypically Black, they were less likely to accept that ride. So it is a concern. Of like, if you show people's profile like pictures and their names and their gender, are you setting them up to be discriminated against? But at the same time, certain groups did say that they would prefer to see those characteristics of people, and that they would be more comfortable sharing a ride knowing who they were getting into a ride with, as opposed to getting to a ride with a complete stranger. So balancing those two things would be fairly complicated to do.
I can perhaps chime in. Austin
Yeah.
nicely set the stage, and some of the strategies that we are seeing potentially possible to balance things out is anonymous reporting and feedback. It's really important that individual passengers feel safe, but also have the opportunity to report any issues that they are facing in the vehicles, and doing so anonymously can help can help increase people's perception of safety. Establishing clear policies and guidelines that will prioritize safety without promoting discrimination will be important. These policies can be based on objective criteria and apply equally to all passengers, ensuring the guidelines are communicated effectively to all stakeholders, including drivers and passengers. So implementing security features were emphasized over and over to make these services more appealing and to enable a secure, direct, perhaps two-way communication channel between riders and dedicated support team and emergency services. So some of the strategies that will help for balancing can be developed, and I would advocate for regular evaluation and review for these policies and practices to identify any potential biases and discriminatory outcomes.
Wonderful. Thank you. Despite all the positive talk about microtransit, I still feel like it's expensive. So how can it be affordable? Therefore, how can it be equitable?
I can take this as it is kind of related to our motivation of the overall study. And it's really a very good question, and probably an issue with most of the emerging technology-based mobility services. In order to lower the cost and enhance the affordability of technology-driven services, we can think of some strategies, for instance, the subsidies and fare integration, implementing discount programs, subsidies, incentives, other cost-reducing structures will be helpful. And these programs can help reduce the cost burden on users, especially those from low-income communities. We do know that a large share of the United States, for instance, almost 40 million live below poverty line. Service providers can also tap into local resources to reduce the cost while expanding the service coverage in areas with limited services, such as in rural and tribal communities. Especially also in the context of TNCs and microtransit, for instance, it would be really important to utilize advanced, efficient routing algorithms that can optimize the microtransit routes, reduce any unnecessary detours, and maximizing the number of passengers served per vehicle. And lastly, but very, very importantly, I would like to emphasize the partnerships with existing transit systems, for instance, like integrating microtransit, if possible, with the existing fixed route transit systems, can create opportunities to develop a complementary network allowing for seamless transfers. We can also consider public-private partnerships, since still private companies or ride-sharing platforms can leverage their existing infrastructure and resources. So I think there are many different ways to make them more affordable and equitable and accessible to a broader range of individuals through some of these strategies.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Let's ask the next question that came in. It says, how best to evaluate these systems to capture social value? The traditional measures such as cost and boarding would suggest these services are too costly to be sustainable. But are there other benefits we should be considering?
I can take this one. So if we look at the results of phase 2 so far, I think it's pretty clear that there definitely are other social value measures that we can be capturing. Chief among them is that currently there are huge swaths of the population that are not getting their needs met. So that means people with disabilities, seniors, people with low income, people in rural areas. These people have severely underserved travel needs at times, and capturing the increased number of rides, where new rides are happening, what the demographics of the new rides are. So that means some sort of data collection when these services are rolled out, and making sure that they're in the right geographies and improving transportation equity rather than just providing service to existing riders. That's one way to measure. Obviously, it's difficult to say exactly how those metrics should be collected, but those are two. And then additionally, that providing transportation to people is not just a good thing in itself. It also connects them to economic opportunities. So once we decrease transportation insecurity, we can look at food insecurity measures and see if they've improved. And we can look at economic income indicators and see if they've improved. So those, I think, are major ways to measure social value outside of pure cost.
Well, thank you so much, EPEC, Austin, and Audrey, for the wonderful webinar today. I am going to open up the evaluation. Please take a few moments to complete the evaluation, as the feedback provided is not only important to our presenters today, but the entire NICR webcast series. So again, on behalf of NICR, the National Institute for Congestion Reduction, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you all real soon.